The rain fell in sheets that night, washing away footprints and evidence alike. But some things can't be erased by water, like the bond that forms when two strangers become each other's only hope. If you're wondering how a single father with 3 kids and a police officer bleeding out in an alley could change an entire police department forever, stay with me. This story might just restore your faith in humanity. If it touches your heart, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel for more incredible true stories that remind us of the unexpected connections that shape our lives. Michael Reeves never planned to be a hero. At 34, his hands were already full raising 3 children alone after his wife's death 2 years earlier. His days revolved around school drop-offs, soccer practice, and stretching his mechanic's salary to cover growing appetites and growing bodies. On that stormy Tuesday night, he was simply taking a shortcut home after working late, eager to relieve the teenage babysitter who had homework of her own to finish. The alley behind Westfield Avenue wasn't a place most people ventured after dark, but Michael knew every shortcut in the neighborhood. Time was a luxury single parents couldn't afford to waste. The beam of his flashlight caught something unusual against the brick wall, a splash of color that didn't belong among the dumpsters and puddles. Drawing closer, his heart nearly stopped. A police officer slumped against the wall, her uniform darkened with blood, radio shattered beside her. Officer Samantha Torres had been on the force for 6 years. At 29, she'd already earned a reputation as one of the most dedicated officers in the 12th precinct. That night, she'd been following a lead on a drug trafficking case when she was ambushed, shot twice and left for dead in the alley where backup couldn't find her. Her radio destroyed, her location unknown to dispatch, the rain washing away her blood into storm drains, she had accepted that this might be her end. Hey, stay with me, Michael urged, kneeling beside her despite the rain soaking through his jeans. His fingers fumbled for his phone while he pressed his free hand against the wound in her side. I'm calling an ambulance. No, she gasped, her eyes fluttering. No ambulance. They're listening to dispatch. Call this number. She recited a number that Michael quickly dialed. Tell them Officer Torres, badge 8294, officer down, location. Her voice faded as she struggled to stay conscious. Michael made the call, speaking to a gruff-voiced detective who demanded details and promised immediate response. But looking at the pale face of the officer before him, Michael knew waiting might mean losing her. I'm getting you to a hospital, he decided, scooping her up despite her weak protests. His car was just around the corner, and the hospital only 10 minutes away if he ran every red light between here and there. My kids, he muttered, calling the babysitter as he drove one-handed, explaining he'd be even later. Officer Torres drifted in and out of consciousness in his passenger seat, her breathing growing more labored with each passing minute. The emergency room erupted into action when Michael carried the bleeding officer through the doors. GSW to the abdomen and shoulder, police officer, he reported with a calmness that surprised even him. As they wheeled her away, her fingers suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Don't tell them, she whispered. Not yet. Corrupt. Inside. Then her hand fell away as the medical team pushed through the double doors, leaving Michael standing alone, covered in a stranger's blood, wondering what he'd just become involved in. Within 20 minutes, the hospital waiting room filled with police officers, their faces grim and questioning. A tall man with captain's bars approached Michael, eyes taking in his blood-stained clothes. You the mechanic who brought her in? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Yes, sir. Michael Reeves. Captain James Holloway. Where exactly did you find my officer? Something in the captain's eyes, a coldness that didn't match his concerned words, made Michael remember Torres' warning. On my way home from work. She was just there on the sidewalk. I didn't see what happened. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. Because dispatch has no record of any officer down call until the hospital notified us. Michael shrugged, heart pounding. I just saw someone who needed help and brought her here. That's all. After more questioning, the police finally left him alone. As Michael prepared to leave, a nurse approached him. "She's asking for you," she said quietly. "Room 412. Be quick, they've posted an officer outside her door," but he stepped away for coffee. Officer Torres looked ghostly against the white hospital sheets, but her eyes were clear and alert. "You didn't tell them," she said when Michael entered. "You asked me not to. Want to tell me why?" She gestured weakly for him to come closer. "I was investigating officers in my own precinct, working with internal affairs. Someone's been tipping off drug dealers about raids, selling evidence. Tonight I got too close." Her voice dropped even lower. "I don't know who to trust. The only person I was reporting to is on vacation, and someone knew exactly where I'd be tonight." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "So what now?" "I've got 3 kids at home who need me alive." A sad smile touched her lips. "I'm sorry to involve you. But I need a favor, one more. In my apartment, there's evidence. If I die—" "You're not going to die," Michael interrupted. "If I die," she continued firmly, "someone needs to get that evidence to Lieutenant Maria Vasquez at the 18th precinct. Not my precinct, the 18th. No one else." Before Michael could respond, the door opened, and a nurse entered with medication. "You need to leave now, sir. Patient needs rest." As Michael stood to leave, Torres caught his hand. "My apartment key is in my uniform pocket. They should have it with my personal effects. 742 Oakwood, apartment 3B. The evidence is in a waterproof bag taped under my kitchen sink." Michael nodded once, then left, his mind racing. He had no desire to get involved in police corruption, but the image of Torres lying in that alley, determined to survive, to see justice done, stayed with him. Getting the key proved surprisingly easy. A sympathetic nurse at the end of her shift helped him retrieve Torres' personal effects, believing his story about needing to feed her cat. The hard part came later that night, after he'd finally made it home, relieved the babysitter, and checked on his sleeping children. Standing in his kitchen, staring at the police officer's key, Michael faced a choice that would change everything. Get involved in something dangerous that had nothing to do with him, or walk away and let whatever corrupt system was in place continue. The face of his late wife seemed to watch him from the photograph on the refrigerator. Sarah had been a public defender, dedicated to justice until cancer took her too young. "What would you do?" he whispered to her image. He already knew the answer. The next morning, after dropping his kids at school, Michael called in sick to work and drove to Officer Torres' apartment. The evidence was exactly where she'd said: a waterproof pouch containing a flash drive, a small notebook, and several photographs of police officers meeting with known drug dealers. As he was leaving her apartment, Michael noticed a car parked across the street, the same unmarked police car he'd seen at the hospital. His heart raced as he casually walked to his own vehicle, the evidence tucked inside his jacket. They were watching her place. Lieutenant Maria Vasquez of the 18th Precinct was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to cut through Michael's carefully prepared story within seconds. "So you just happened to find a critically injured officer, save her life, and now you just happen to have evidence of police corruption that she's been gathering?" Her tone was skeptical, but she accepted the waterproof pouch, examining its contents with growing seriousness. "I'm just keeping a promise," Michael said. "She seemed to think you were the only one she could trust." Vasquez's expression softened slightly. "Samantha and I worked together years ago. She was a rookie when I was her training officer." She looked up at Michael. "You've put yourself at risk, Mr. Reeves. These officers, if what Sam suspected is true, they won't hesitate to come after anyone who threatens them." "I have 3 kids," Michael said quietly. "I can't be looking over my shoulder for corrupt cops." "No, you can't," Vasquez agreed. Which is why you're going to be under my precinct's protection until this is resolved. I'll have officers I trust personally watching your home. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael's life took on a surreal quality. Plainclothes officers from the 18th precinct drove his children to school. Lieutenant Vasquez became a regular visitor to his home, initially to discuss the case but increasingly to share meals with his family. His children, initially wary of the police presence, warmed to Vasquez's no-nonsense manner and the way she never talked down to them. Meanwhile, Officer Torres recovered slowly in the hospital, moved to a secure location known only to Vasquez and a select few trusted officers. The evidence she had gathered, combined with what Michael had retrieved, led to a massive internal investigation. Captain Holloway and 4 other officers from the 12th precinct were arrested 3 weeks after the night in the alley. The case broke wide open when one of the younger officers, facing decades in prison, agreed to testify against his superiors. The corruption had run deeper than anyone imagined. Nearly a quarter of the precinct had been involved in some capacity. The day Samantha Torres was released from the hospital, Michael brought his children to meet her. His youngest daughter, Emma, presented the officer with a handmade card featuring a stick figure in a police uniform with a cape. "Dad says you're like a superhero," Emma explained seriously. "Fighting bad guys even when they're supposed to be good guys." Torres knelt despite her still healing wounds to accept the card. "Your dad's the real hero," she told Emma. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't running into danger, it's doing the right thing when it would be easier not to." The story might have ended there. A corrupt police captain brought to justice, a dedicated officer vindicated, a single father returning to his normal life. But real life rarely ties up so neatly. The investigation into the 12th precinct revealed systemic problems throughout the department. In response, the mayor established a civilian oversight committee to rebuild trust between the police and the community. And who better to represent the average citizen than someone who had seen both the corruption and the dedication of officers firsthand? Michael initially refused the mayor's request to join the committee. "I'm just a mechanic," he protested. "I don't know anything about policing." "That's exactly why we need you," the mayor insisted. "You're not part of the system. You see it with fresh eyes." It was Torres who finally convinced him. Now promoted to detective and transferred to the 18th precinct under Vasquez's command, she visited Michael's home one evening after his children were asleep. "The department needs to change," she said simply. "And change doesn't come from inside a broken system. It comes from people like you, people who step up when it would be easier to walk away." 6 months after that rainy night in the alley, the newly formed Oversight Committee held its first public meeting. Michael sat beside retired judges, community activists, and legal experts, still feeling out of place in his one good suit. But when citizens approached the microphone to share their experiences with police, both positive and negative, he listened with an understanding no one else on the panel possessed. The changes came slowly at first: new training protocols, community engagement requirements, a complete restructuring of internal affairs. But as months turned into years, the culture began to shift. Officers who had once viewed civilian oversight as a threat came to see it as protection against the corruption that had nearly destroyed their department. Detective Torres became a regular visitor to the Reeves household, initially to update Michael on the implementation of new policies, but eventually simply as a friend. She taught his oldest son to change the oil in his first car, helped his middle daughter with her criminal justice homework, and read bedtime stories to Emma, who remained convinced that Torres secretly wore a cape under her detective's badge. Lieutenant Vasquez, promoted to captain after Holloway's conviction, often joined them for Sunday dinners. "Never thought I'd see the day," she remarked once, watching Torres help Michael's children set the table. "When I started on the force 30 years ago, we viewed civilians as either victims or perps. Never as partners. And we viewed cops as either threats or saviors," Michael replied. "Never as people just trying to do a difficult job." 3 years after that night in the rain, the 12th precinct, once the most corrupt in the city, had the highest community approval rating and the lowest use of force incidents in the department. Officers who had once closed ranks to protect their own now understood that true loyalty meant holding each other to the highest standards. The story of the mechanic who found a dying officer and helped expose corruption became department legend, told to every new recruit during their ethics training. But for Michael and Samantha, the real story wasn't about corruption or heroism, it was about the family they had unexpectedly built together. On a clear spring evening, 4 years after they met, Michael and Samantha stood in the same alley where he had found her bleeding in the rain. Now it was transformed, a community garden planted by officers and neighborhood residents working side by side, a symbol of the new relationship between police and the people they served. "I never thanked you properly," Samantha said, her hand finding his as they stood among the flowering plants. "Not just for saving my life, but for helping me save the department." Michael smiled, thinking of how far they had all come. "We saved each other," he said simply. And that's what community is supposed to be about. As the sun set over the garden that had once been a crime scene, Michael reflected on how a single choice in a moment of crisis had rippled outward, changing not just his life but an entire city. Sometimes the most powerful acts of heroism aren't dramatic rescues or confrontations with villains, they're the quiet decisions to do what's right, even when it would be easier to walk away. If this story touched your heart, remember that we all face moments where our choices can change lives. Sometimes the greatest heroes are ordinary people who simply refuse to look the other way. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread this message of hope and the reminder that one person really can make a difference.